Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I'm really excited for this conversation tonight. For those who don't know, my name is Grace Madigan. I'm the director of the Evergrey, which is a daily newsletter that aims at building community between Seattleites and their city. And so, like I said, I'm really excited about this conversation tonight. We've got a great group of panelists. As you know, the pandemic has impacted everyone and everything. And while many have, risen to the different challenges that they faced, one of the things that I think people have seen from this past year or so are some of the major gaps and holes in the social safety nets for people. And so that's sort of why we're here tonight. We're going to be talking about what this economic recovery looks like when we focus on making it equitable, especially for women, because as we look at the numbers and where research is being done, we saw that nearly 2.1 million women left the workforce this past year, and a huge portion of those women were women of color. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to my co-host, Katelyn Moran, who will introduce herself and we can get this started.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, my name's Katelyn. My pronouns are she, her. I am content and communications manager at Civic Commons. Civic Commons, for those who aren't familiar, is a relatively new initiative here in the Seattle region. It's been around for a little over 2 years. And our focus is on elevating community voices and building cross-sector connections to address the root causes of inequities in Greater Seattle. So this is very much in our wheelhouse. And we've been partnering with the Evergrey for roughly a year now. And if I'm a familiar face to some folks in the audience, that may be because I was formerly director of the Evergrey. So I've been on these events before, kind of in Grace's shoes, but now we've sort of switched roles, but are continuing to do the same awesome work. I think this is our 4th event in the last 6 months, kind of focusing on issues involving civic engagement, inequities, and just giving folks in Seattle ideas of how they can get more involved and try and make our community a better place. So really excited with the great group of panelists that we have here tonight, and excited to talk about this issue. I became a mother during the pandemic, so I have been kind of in the thick of it from that perspective, and also just very interested and engaged in a lot of the conversations that are surfacing about women in the workforce and women at home, and how the pandemic has kind of shaken up all those dynamics. So
congratulations.
Oh, thank you. So that's me in a nutshell. And I'm going to hand it over to our panelists now to introduce themselves, tell you a bit about the organization they're representing. And if you're able to do so, I'd love to do a kickoff question, which is just to name one thing that helped you get through the past 16 months of the pandemic. That could be a person, an actual physical object, an idea, however you want to take it, it's up to you. And let's start with Regina.
Hi, well, I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. I'm the director of the Washington State Women's Commission, which sits within the Office of the Governor. And we really are, we were established in 2018 with the goal of being a policy voice for women and girls in the state of Washington. And so our authorizing legislation really charges us with kind of being the focal point for issues that disproportionately impact women and girls, and to advise both the governor and the legislature on, policy recommendations in terms of finding solutions to some of these big issues. And certainly the pandemic and its economic impact, as well as its health impact, have created a lot of opportunities for us to need to be advocates, as I know that all of you are as well. So again, thanks for inviting us to the discussion. And it would not be unfair to say that Haagen-Dazs white chocolate truffle raspberry ice cream is a big part of what got me through COVID, but I also have an extraordinary group of family and friends who, surrounded me, if only via, video and phone calls. So, I think as most of us have learned, it really was the coming together of community, not necessarily in person, but just in spirit that I think has gotten so many of us through.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Tang. I'm the Executive Director of Families of Color Seattle, folks. My pronouns are she, her. And I have been in this position since March last year, so I've had the same start date as coronavirus. I was working for folks before, so I was an internal hire, and it's been quite a roller coaster, really becoming the ED at the beginning of the pandemic and trying to do a very different planning than what the strategic plan of the organization was supposed to have been for the past year and a half. But there's resilience in our communities, and that's what inspired all of us, our board and our staff, to continue offering our programs for parent support groups, community resources and events, racial equity work, our workshops, family engagements. So we pivoted to provide all those in an online format. It's really hard to pick just one thing that kept me going, because it was a combination of things. But I would say having that purpose, that work purpose, having my kids at home all the time because schools were closed, and knowing with the hope and certainty that there was going to be a light at the end of this tunnel, just following the research and knowing that there are going to be scientific discoveries to get us out of this. And also knowing that our ancestors have been through similar tragedies and even worse, and that we come from resilient people who've gone through a lot.
Thank you, Christine. Hi, everyone. My name is Vi. I work at UTOPIA, Washington, and I am the vaccine ambassador there. I would say I was brought on specifically because because of my lived experience, I would say, because I didn't have access growing up to my Polynesian roots. And I grew up in just the cutie BIPOC community and here in Seattle in the Central District area. And I was brought on to basically use my skills as a graphic designer to virtually spread our engagement with youth and young adults throughout our cutie BIPOC communities. And the other reason why I feel like I might have been an important aspect of UTOPIA is because there's a subculture called the Kiki ballroom scene, where we have, where it's cutie BIPOC centered and it's mutual aid. So there's no actual organization. It's more of just a culture. And we basically are surrogate families for those that have been pushed out of their own biological families. And I have a strong relation to that because I grew up in the foster care system as well. And I experienced homelessness. And throughout all of that, I was able to find my chosen family. And because I'm able to utilize my skills with both the Pacifica and the Kiki ballroom scene, I'm able to provide that access to housing, food, transportation, whatever these kids need to get access to the vaccine or just information. And I would say that's been helping me get through this past year, because a lot of what I do is about celebration and implementing joy within our cultures. And because I have the privilege to be a graphic designer, I can do that visually for not just me, but for my kids, my chosen kids, and everybody in the community. So thank you.
Thank you so much. To start things off, I would like to ask all of you, this conversation's about how the pandemic has affected women and women of color specifically. An attempt to sort of get a better, real life examples of this. I want to know if you could provide a specific story or anecdote involving either yourself or someone you know that sort of illustrates the challenges and disparities that the past year or so have brought to the surface. So I don't know if anyone has an immediate story that they can think of, but feel free to jump in.
Okay, I'll go first. So Grace, you mentioned the 2.1 million women who were forced out of the workforce as a result of the pandemic. And we know that so many of those jobs are in sectors where women and those who identify as women are overrepresented. And so we know that childcare, education, even kind of some of the caretaking fields and hospitality are sectors where women are really overrepresented, particularly women of color. Vi talks about her kids. My kids are actually 29 and 30 now. And my daughter is a massage therapist and worked in hospitality for the Hilton chain. And at the start of the pandemic, they were down to 10% occupancy across the Hilton network. And so a majority of staff actually were laid off for a minimum of about 12 weeks. And even when the hotels were able to start bringing some people back, they were only able to bring back really a fraction of those who they've laid off because of the continued financial strain of not having travelers to serve. And so I think that there's not any one of us probably who doesn't know a person or several people who lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. And thankfully, I think this is where we have the opportunity to come together, and help lift and support those. I would always do that with my daughter anyway, but this created yet another opportunity for me to be a supportive mom. But really had, and then I also, I have grandchildren, my son's children, and really had so much empathy for the mothers of my grandchildren. And as Christine described, what it means to be home with kiddos full time, and trying to be a great parent and educate and be attentive to to jobs. I know it just was an extraordinary Herculean task for so many women, and just it's been incredible to watch the resiliency, as Christine talked about how resilient so many of us are. And to remind ourselves that, while certainly these last 15 months have been really hard, definitely not harder than what most of our ancestors went through. So.
This is Christine. I've been trying to think of one instance, like one example, and it's so hard because I feel like if I give one example, then I don't do justice to all the other examples that I'm thinking about. And it's so hard to really prioritize which one is the most impactful story. I'm thinking about our organization, Families of Color Seattle, and we provide services, especially to families who have young children. A lot of our parent support groups are for parents of newborns and toddlers. We do have some multi-age affinity groups, but that also means that not only do we provide services to families who are very directly affected by the pandemic, and when it comes to childcare and access to school, preschool so pre-K to 12, but also it affected our capacity as an organization, impacted every single one of us on the staff. So I'd say everyone on staff except for one person was a parent. And the same for our board. All but one were women on the board at the time, and all of them had young children at home. So when we think about the challenge that we had as an employer and as a community-based organization, we were so disproportionately affected just because we were mothers, most of us mothers or parents of young children at home. So we had it coming from all sides, and especially with all the racialized violence that manifested last year, it just felt like so much. So I wanted to mention that because we're, especially as we're talking about the disproportionate impact on women, and especially the sectors that primarily employ women, especially given my role, right, the capacity in which I'm here as the UT of Families of Color Seattle. I would love to see some data disseminated to like, who are those women who left the workforce? And I was able to find some data from September when schools resumed, and in many places in the country, they were not open in person last year. 80% of the workforce that exited that month were women, which to me directly links to parenthood, to motherhood especially, because even though we're in 2021, it is still in the majority of households, it is the mothers who really take on that additional work related to housework and childcare and managing everything related to children, activities, school. Again, I'm not going to say that's happening all the time. I said the majority, not in every single household, but it's there. And all of us who work in the fields and know what I'm talking about. So the fact that we have, 40% of mothers who reported that they added at least 3 more additional hours of caregiving, in addition to what they were doing before, right? So it's work and additional hours of caregiving and the additional housework that has to, comes from having everybody at home all the time. So that's really impactful. That being said, I'm thinking of all the other stories that I heard from our communities, especially in the first weeks or couple of months of the pandemic, when relief wasn't yet available, when everybody was trying to figure out how to support, and we're talking about different levels of government. There wasn't anything available. And fortunately, we were able to get some COVID relief out to some of our families. And it was really heartbreaking trying to decide from all the requests that we were getting, okay, who's going to get the relief, who's going to get the money. And at the time, there were people who were concerned about being evicted because they were in one of these sectors that was not protected, right? They had a food service job, or they had one of these hourly employment situations where as soon as COVID hit and they were closed, they had nothing to fall back on. So as hard as it was for me, I feel like I can't do justice to those stories. I can't just pick one, because there were so many who were saying, I'm like literally about to give birth and I have another young child, and we're being threatened with eviction during a pandemic. Right? I'll stop here. Thank you for the question.
Vi, do you have anything to add? I know you had mentioned working with some youth with the Kiki program, I believe. So maybe did you hear any sort of stories or incidents, anecdotes from the youth you were working with, or observe anything, how sort of this affected their family dynamics maybe and whatnot?
Oh yeah, I was actually gonna use my own experience from this past year. So I'm 27 now, and last year when the pandemic started, that's when I finally was able to live on my own. So as soon as I was able to have my own place, boom, the pandemic hit. And I was actually working a food service job, and I was let go. And it was really hard to navigate with the resources that was given to me, because I only had a limited experience, and I wasn't able to find stable employment, which was super scary. And the only way that was able to get me by was through the Kiki scene, and everything there is mutual aid. So it's more about networking. And that's what we do with that culture, is that a bunch of cutie BIPOC people come together, share resources, and we distribute that information, not just to ourselves, but to whoever that needs it. And because I was able to work freelance as a graphic designer, I was able to work independently. It wasn't steady though, which was the scary part about it. But because I was able to post a lot about social media, and at the time, the protests, I went with my kids and like my brothers and my sisters, my chosen family. And through that, we were able to get and utilize even more resources, because that's like the protest is not just the protest. It's to be able to share stories, celebrate each other, and make sure that we as a community are supporting one another. And the scary part wasn't just that, but just seeing like my sisters go through what I was going through and not finding the right trusted people to give us support too, you know? And it took a while for me to actually accept that support from other organizations, because as trans women of color, or just women of color, it's like we are the only ones that can take care of ourselves. It's hard to put ourselves into a space where we're not guaranteed an answer. And throughout this past year, I've had to learn to trust other organizations that are willing to help, to trust other people that just want to help just because you want to help. And I've always been that person, but it was always strange to receive that from somebody else. But thankfully, because of UTOPIA, they were able to use me for what I can offer and stabilize my employment and my housing.
Thank you for sharing that and for your vulnerability. And we're so glad that you're in a better space now. So thank you. Yeah, and leading into the next question, I'm glad you brought up mutual aid groups, because I think it's been so inspiring to see that kind of either, take off or just become more visible during the pandemic. But I also, part of me can't help but feel like it points to, the gaps in our system. And, it's great when people are able to support each other directly, but it's also kind of makes you wonder why can't we as a society step up and take care of folks so that they're not in these positions in the first place. So my next question was, what's at the top of your wish list for policy changes at the local or federal level? And if you don't have something policy in mind, that's fine. It could just be what needs to change most urgently at the systemic level to support women, particularly women of color, to kind of address these challenges that you all spoke so eloquently about.
Thank you. Well, policy work is at the center of what we do really at the Women's Commission. And as a policy advocate for the last 20 years, I have so many things that are important, and so many policy issues that it's been hard to watch continue to be issues even after a couple of decades. But I've been so encouraged, actually. I think during the pandemic, our state in particular, we're able to brainstorm and decide to invest in people and helping to lift people up and really help folks who are in the position that Vi was in, and the families that Christine talked about. And so I'll say I'm really proud to work for the governor and in a state where really a lot of money was infused early on, additional layers of unemployment, additional weeks of paid family leave, and really infusing money to the community organizations that were supporting communities like all of ours. I think right now, again, going to the wish list, and again, I'm so encouraged that this is already starting to happen At the federal level, you may have been hearing some of the conversations about childcare as infrastructure. So again, when we go back and look at the numbers of the 2.1 million women who became unemployed, most of them, many of them, not most, many of them did so as a result of needing to do care responsibilities at home, like Christine described. And had we had a better childcare infrastructure where small business childcare providers were not going out of business because folks lost their jobs and couldn't bring their children, and there was no safety net for those providers. So an already strained childcare system really almost fractured. And that's another instance where, again, our state really did a good job of trying to come in and infuse and help those small businesses reopen and help bring back childcare capacity. And so while affordable childcare has been this really protracted issue for decades, surprisingly, we've seen new and urgent policy discussions happening as a result of the pandemic. So I'd say that, as a former, single mom who came out of an abusive marriage when my kiddos were 1.5 and 3, and I actually got into social policy and social justice work after, trying to access, it's called TANF today, it was called AFDC at the time, and experiencing such indignity in accessing that system. I just knew that there had to be a better way, and I didn't want other moms to have to continue to experience systems like that one as negatively as I was experiencing it. And so, as I said, just to see the commitment of many leaders today at both the state and the federal level to try to bring some resolve to the childcare issue has been really encouraging to me.
Thank you, Regina, for bringing that up. I completely agree that childcare is, it should be a right. It should be a right. And it was hard in Seattle, even before the pandemic. Right? There are stories about parents who have to put themselves on waiting lists as soon as they find out that they're expecting a child. And we all know how it went once the pandemic hit us. And unfortunately, I'm so glad that at least childcare was prioritized for essential workers and these people who had to work outside the home had a better chance at accessing childcare than the rest of the population. We're at the point where vaccines are available for everyone over 12. We're at the point where we're hearing about vaccines soon getting not just authorization, but approval. And as a society, I want to make sure that we do not forget their children, who are younger than 12, who are still not vaccinated, for whom there's still not a childcare plan, like even this fall. So there are elementary schools in our public school systems that do not have childcare yet confirmed. Like, I don't know, so my children are in Seattle public schools. I do not know if there's going to be a Boys and Girls Club or some other childcare opportunity for after school. So you can imagine trying to plan as a mother, as a woman, trying to plan your schedule, your career, to accept a job or not, or to decide if you still have to be part-time or if you can go back to work with that big unknown as are you going to have childcare for your children? You can't, you really can't. So that's why you see that reflected in numbers, that all the women, the mothers and parents who've had to make the sacrifice, and maybe who could make the sacrifice, because I'm sure there's some parents who had to find a way to keep working, and unfortunately, perhaps their children, had to find alternatives, and even some being left at home. earlier than otherwise they would have liked to.
I definitely agree with Christine and Regina, and just regards of just support for us and having access to that, whether it be healthcare, funds, or just organization. And I think for like just speaking on Utopias, it's more about like, I think healthcare is a really big thing for us, just as women of color, because we all know like the historical facts about what doctors filter through with trainings and how, I mean, the lack of trainings that they have when it comes to treating us medically and just professionally. And just getting access to doctors that represent us. And I think Utopia has been able to support that in a way where I was able to lead our first, or not our first, our vaccine clinic just last week. And we want to build on that where we're able to supply like hormone replacement treatment for our younger trans girls, or just girls that don't have access to that, along with other resources. Like we have like non-perishable food pantry and clothes as well. And the other thing that I feel like is never really talked about, but is super important, is finding out, or not finding out, but just being able to have access to like mental health more easier and support us in that way. Because I don't think it's just a fact for, in order for us to be supported, everybody will be supported, right? And I think that's just it for my wish list. Like that's just, it is, that is what it is, you know? But yeah.
Yeah, so kind of, Regina, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I love that there has been in the last year this discussion, as Vi just talked about centering women of color as we look at policy solutions, because we know that if women of color are lifted, everyone is lifted. And that's a really important discussion that I feel like I've only been hearing, in the last year or two. And as I mentioned, I worked with the YWCA previously, and if you have an opportunity to visit ywca.org, they talk a lot about, at the federal policy level, really advocating for those solutions that, again, are centered on women and girls of color. And so it's so exciting to me that that conversation is actually taking place, and wasn't even 5 years ago. So I'm encouraged.
Yeah, so kind of going off of that, I guess like one of the big questions is like, how do we prevent something like this from happening again? It was just so blatant that like this affected women so much more so than it did, men and just like women of color, like we've been talking about. What do we do to prevent something like this? Are we focusing on policy? Are we focusing on conversations, like cultural shifts? Kind of conversations need to be happening, what things need to be done. Let's start with that. There's a second part to this question, but I think that's probably good enough to start with.
Yeah, I would like to see all those things. Mm-hmm. Cultural shifts, conversations, continued conversation. We should not be getting bored of this topic. This is a topic that affects all of us, including those who are not women, including those who are not parents or who don't have young children anymore, who do not have children yet or never will have. We're all part of the society, and we do not operate in a vacuum. So we have to protect and support the most marginalized and the most vulnerable in our society. And in most cases, those are, BIPOC young children and families. And they're the ones struggling the most in situations like that. And of course, the more marginalized identities you add to that, whether it's sexual orientation or gender identity that's not conforming, or disabilities. I mean, it's just
layers upon layers upon layers.
Yeah, layers upon layers of marginalization, oppression, and just exponential disproportionalities. So I think we have conversations, we keep pushing for changes in policy and legislation to provide that safety net for our families. This should not happen again. This should not take us by surprise. I'm not trying in any way to be pessimistic, but we knew that a pandemic was going to happen at some point. And we know that there's probably another one that might happen in our lifetime. We'd be lucky if it doesn't, right? So we should be ready for anything like this, and just to have the social safety nets for women, for children, and for families.
I second everything that Regina and Christine were saying. Yeah, I think when it comes to like access, support, and shoot, I forgot what I was gonna say. No, but for like this, in order for this to not happen again, it's just to realize the work that we put in and work off of that. It's about representation. The more that we're able to employ ourselves and provide resources and politics that protect us, that's the answer right there. And for women, which I love about all of us here, is that we talk about kids a lot, and it's because it's common for us to have access to the youth, and that's more like women. Youth is more than just men, so it's simple to me when it comes to providing the support where it needs to be to protect us and uplift us.
And back to that point about being ready, and us talking about these support systems. Well, those support systems, in order for them to be in place, they have to be funded, right? And so one of the things that I'm encouraged by, as someone who not only works on state policy but federal policy, is our current administration is working on something called the American Family Plan, and they really refer to it as a generational investment. So much like the 50 years ago invested in things like Head Start and anti-poverty programs. We know that over the last 20 years, so much of that has been eroded, and so it's just a really exciting time where leaders at the federal level are really being bold and thinking big about what kinds of investments need to happen for families to be lifted out of poverty, have great job opportunities, have the underlying support, have funding to make sure that folks, particularly young people who are homeless and don't have options. It's really our responsibility to make sure that the most vulnerable among us, whether they're children or youth or BIPOC families, really have at least a baseline of support. And so again, have seen a lot of that eroded over the last several years. And I'm so encouraged about this moment in time that we're in relative to our federal government having a view toward investing in the programs that you all are uplifting.
Well, that tees off our next and final official question quite nicely. But before we get to that, I just want to remind folks that we will have some time for audience questions. So please drop those into the chat if you haven't already. And yeah, I think, speaking of lifting up the most vulnerable in our community, we wanted to be sure to ask you all if you have ideas for more like everyday things that people can do to support women in their lives, women in their community. I think we've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about policy level things or more systemic things, but for this, we wanted to kind of dial it back more towards the ground level. And why don't we start with Vi, because I know you are very directly involved in the community and you've talked a lot about mutual aid. So is there anything that folks who might be listening, watching tonight can do immediately that isn't like a huge ask, I guess?
I would say participate in functions or events that we throw, but respect the space that you're in, and utilize your privilege in ways that support that exposure that we need. Because networking is like super important within BIPOC communities, especially the culture the type of culture that I'm in. And I think the more that we're able to get that type of connection with a guest, the more we have a reach to other people that may support us. And just when, I don't know, I think the most important thing that has been to me with the Kiki ballroom scenes is that we have these balls, and we host these balls to celebrate these stories, these talents, and all kinds of performance art. And I think the more that you focus on the type of joy that you can support, what's wrong with that? And it's entertaining. So I think that like those are a couple of ideas that you could definitely utilize.
Katelyn, I'll admit that when I read this question, and I think my mind probably just thinks in terms of broader systems, but I really had read some really good research about women in the workplace, and they gave several recommendations, not only about what companies could do, but what individuals working in those companies could do relative to supporting women, but Black women in particular. And one of the things that really struck me is it said, there were a number of things related to women in the workforce. I'm actually going to drop that link here once I'm done, because I think it's a really great document that could be helpful to a lot of folks. But one of the things that was so basic that caught me is it said, if you're an employer or a colleague, when racial violence happens, don't be silent about it. Don't not talk to your Black coworker and acknowledge that it even happened, because it's such an isolating thing for us. I'm the mother of a young Black man, and I have two grandsons who are going to grow up to be, Black men. And these are just horrible, jarring, moments that consume us. And if the people around us don't even acknowledge that it's happening, it really can make you feel isolated. I think I mentioned that I moved over to Olympia from Eastern Washington several months ago. And although I'm very excited about this position, and it was the catalyst to my moving, I will admit that after our local law enforcement fired tear gas and rubber bullets on Black Lives Matters protesters, while white armed supremacists were allowed to walk around kind of unfettered, it made me feel as though this is not a place for me. And where I previously had felt a part of the community, there wasn't enough of the community that spoke up about that as loudly as I felt comfortable with. And I no longer felt at home in that space. And I think that sometimes that's what, so I appreciated how you made the reference to power and privilege. So I think if you're someone from a majority community who has privilege and voice, it's not helpful if you don't use it. And, not only to acknowledge, your BIPOC friends and colleagues, but also to speak to the power structure. One of the things that was most encouraging is that nationally, we saw that the movement around racial reckoning was as large, if not larger than the civil rights movement in terms of the number of folks that weren't from the BIPOC community who came out to be loud voices. And again, that wasn't the case in every community, but nationwide, we know that the crisis was heard and quite frankly paid attention to because not so much because BIPOC voices were lifting up, because we've always been doing that, but because other folks were using their privilege and saying this matters. And, that was enormous. And I think if we're going to have any significant change, it's only going to be if all of those voices continue to back the movement.
Yeah, that's so important. And what came up to me as I was listening to both of you respond was we're never one thing, right? And I'm speaking especially about women of color now. We're never one thing. We're mothers and aunties and spouses, or we're parenting solo. So by acknowledging and standing up against racism, you are helping us. By acknowledging and standing up against ableism, you're helping us, because there are plenty of women of color with disabilities, or who are raising children with disabilities, or have someone disabled in their lives. If you are standing up and speaking out against other types of discrimination and unfair and inequitable policies, you are helping women, and especially women of color. And as you said earlier, Regina, by centering Black and Brown women, you are uplifting all women. And I would like to think especially about, I consider myself fortunate to have been in this position during the unrest the last year, because when I heard from friends, the day after Breonna Taylor was murdered, or I'm thinking about all the killings and all the injustice, and that they went into work, whether it was a physical or virtual space, and there was nothing said about it. I mean, that silence is poison to the soul. Silence in face of injustice is poison to the soul, especially when it happens in an environment where you thought you were accepted and you're part of that community. So I'm like, what can we do? I would say, going back to the response from earlier, continue these conversations. I feel like it can be too repetitive. If we don't have a solution, we keep having them. We keep petitioning and talking with legislatures and lobbying to change policy and change legislation. This is not new. I mean, this is not new. This just unveils the injustice and inequities that were always present. If you think back to the New Deal, those injustices, like those what are raised blind, so to speak, policies, still uplifted the ones who had mostly the 9-to-5 jobs, or like the unionized jobs, or did not uplift or protect the rights of domestic workers, for instance, or the daily laborers. So those injustices were there. We should not be surprised that it is women and people in the lowest paid, most vulnerable jobs who are disproportionately bearing the cost of this pandemic. This does not surprise that anyone who holds public office. It shouldn't be. If it's a surprise to them, they shouldn't be holding public office.
Well, thank you for those powerful words. That's a great period on the conversation. So that wraps up the questions that we had planned. There are a couple questions in the chat, but we would welcome a few more. So if you have questions for any of our panelists, please drop them in the next couple minutes. One question that's in here is about navigating the career market. This person asks, is it recommended to apply to any field available, regardless if you are a high school diploma, GED holder, or even a master's degree alum? So I'm not sure how much expertise any of you have in the current job market and navigating it, but I think, this person might welcome any kind of advice. I think more places are hiring now, but I'm sure there's a lot of competition, and it can be tough to figure out which positions you should devote your time to actually applying for.
So again, certainly not an expert in the current job market, but Katelyn, to your point, there are many places that are reopening now as a result of the reopening of the economy. Having said that, I think I'm a big believer in, of course, there's the survival issues, and sometimes you do just have to take a job just in order to meet basic needs. But I'm such a believer in really focusing on what your passions and talents are, and being laser focused in your job search and in networking around where you really want to be. So Vi talked a lot about for those of us who have access to opportunities or networks where we have friends and folks who are hiring managers, being able to connect them with those that we know need opportunity. That's one of probably the things that gives me the most joy in my role. There's some benefit to having been around a long time, a lot of people. And so when people have opportunities, they will often share them with me to share with my network. And I'm so excited when my network is growing with young people and folks who are at the beginning of their careers, and I can hopefully try to impart not only some wisdom, but also some access to my network. So I would just encourage the person who said, do I just take anything? Well, certainly if you've got an immediate survival need, taking something and doing it while you're also pursuing, your passions is important. So when I was a young mom, I think I've had about 20 jobs during the course of my career, but in my mid-20s, I started out in banking. As I mentioned earlier, after my own experience, negative experience with the social welfare systems, I shifted my academic focus really to find a way to be able to advocate for others to have a different and better experience. But I worked for an airline in a reservations call center, did a lot of things that weren't on my career track, but where every place I picked up a skill that ultimately helped me advance in my career. So I guess that's kind of my long-winded answer of saying, really focus on where you feel like you will thrive and where your passions are. And it's been my experience that, success really follows.
Yeah, that's really comprehensive advice, and you have such interesting life experience in so many fields. So that I hope that the participant feels encouraged to apply and pursue their passion as they're addressing their immediate needs. I wanted to address specifically the question about education. There are some jobs where a certain degree or maybe certain certification is required. Outside those positions, I would encourage anyone to apply regardless of their education level, as long as they are, qualified to do the job and they have the skills and the experience or transferable skills. They should apply.
I wanted to add, there's this statistic that says, a woman, many women, if they don't see themselves meeting every single bullet point on a job description, they won't apply. Whereas men will only qualify for 60%, only have experience in 60% of the bullet points and will have the confidence to apply anyway. And that was shocking to me. And again, I know so many amazing, powerful women, and it's unsettling to think that we often hold ourselves back just in our own heads, underestimating ourselves. And I will admit that that probably doesn't apply to me. I'm somebody who probably has always applied for stretch positions. And, what I've learned is that, again, if you have basic competencies and a passion for what you're doing, some of the technical detail can be learned later. Any of us who has, passion and an openness to learn and the ability to complement your talents with those of other folks, where you might, lack skill. There's almost always a way to succeed if you believe in yourself.
I don't know if you want to add anything else. I know you talked about freelancing, and that's a whole nother sort of different beast when talking about jobs and stuff. So I don't know if you want to add on about your experience with that during this past year.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, it's crazy, working freelance, because it's like you have the space to charge whatever you want, but it's kind of like, it scares you a little bit on who to charge and if they will say yes or no. But I realized a no is just gonna be a no. There's gonna be somebody else that will take that rate for your labor. And it's something that I apply to a lot of the kids that I oversee or just mentor within the Kiki scene, where we are our own businesses. And we can utilize that to solidify our voice and our value. And I think that, to me, it makes me feel so confident, and I was smiling so much when Regina was talking that she did this, she did that, she did this, nothing stopped her. And I think I want to see that in these kids, because that's what we all deserve. And the freelance world, I think it is just about confidence. You just gotta go in, know what you know, be confident in what you know, and whatever labor that you have, that needs to be valued, and you got to come to terms with that. So,
if I could elaborate on that, one of the things that I feel like has been a positive byproduct of the racial reckoning is, you talked about feeling confident in asking that your work be valued, right? And after last summer, when the corporations were saying, "Hey, we want to hear from BIPOC voices," there were people who began to say, "Okay, yes, but don't ask all of us to speak on your panels for free or come talk to your companies for free. Our time is valuable." And what I so appreciated about particularly younger women is that you all were not afraid to say that, to say, "Yes, I'm happy to come share my experience and pay me." Right.
Yeah.
And so when I was earlier in my career, I was, as I said, working jobs and quite frankly, volunteering in all the organizations that, where my passions were. And I want to say I was probably, almost 40 before I had a position like this that paid me to do the kind of, social justice lobbying work that I do. And if I could just share one quick moment. My first year in law school, I interned for Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who was at the time chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. And during that summer, after my first year of law school, my kids were 6 and 8. No, I'm sorry, 5 and 7. And I was a single mom, didn't have an income, was really living off from student loans, volunteering as a congressional intern. And I was probably in my mid to late 20s at the time. And about 5 years ago, I went back as the CEO of a large social service organization on a lobby day. And I walked, look, I'm going to break, my voice is going to break. So I walked in through the same megometers in the House of Representatives, building that I walked through when I was in my late 20s, broke as hell, young single mother volunteering for free to get this experience. And back then, all I wanted to do was be the person that I got to walk through those doors in, 5 years ago. And it was it's probably more like 10 years ago, but it was such an incredible moment to just reflect back on how many blood, sweat, and tears, you poured into trying to do this thing that you cared so much about. And, there were so many times when it would have been tempting to quit because it was so hard. And so again, when I, have an opportunity to talk with younger women who are earlier in their careers, I just really try to emphasize, you will almost never fail if you continue to invest your energies on the things that you really care about. And while, it may unfortunately, hopefully it won't take you as long to fully realize, your dream and income potential, but, even as I'm going to say underemployed as I was for a number of years, I'm a member of the governor's cabinet now. So, it might have been hard, but it was worth it. And how amazing to have the opportunity to have impact for so many women. But, had I given up at any of those points where I was broke and it was hard, I wouldn't be in a place where I have the opportunity to do this work that is so meaningful and fulfills me personally.
Please be on TED Talk.
Say again.
Please be on TED Talk.
Thank you. I'm working on one.
And that's the link.
Okay.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, everyone, for joining, those who are watching, and for our wonderful panelists. This was such an enlightening and great conversation, I think. And I am so glad that I got to be a part of it. And I just want to thank you guys once again for taking the time out of your day to be a part of this. We're going to be posting this on our social media, so you can find that if you miss any parts of this or you want to revisit it. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add, Katelyn, but that about does it for us.
No, that was super uplifting and inspiring. So thank you all for being willing to talk about the hard parts and the struggles, but also the glimmers of hope and leaving us with so many points to jump off on. So really appreciate
Thank you
it.
for having us.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for watching at home.
All right.
Have a great evening. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.